Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Bible Search and Rescue. Bible Search and Rescue is part of the Westar Institute. My name is Chad Vinters. I'm the host of Bible Search and Rescue, and I have the distinct pleasure of being a scholar for Westar. So I love this organization, and we get to do some great things with education. Today on Bible Search and Rescue, we're going to take a little bit of a different approach to things than we normally do. A lot of times we focus more on the ancient past. That's more of an emphasis for us. But today I wanted to take some time to take a look at a controversial but important part of the history of the United States, particularly as it pertains to religion. And that is the story of the Ku Klux Klan. And one of the reasons why I chose to approach this was because a few years ago, I saw so many things being said online and so many memes and infographics and everything else that had no sources to them and just didn't seem to have any accuracy that I decided to write an article for Westar's Fourth R magazine, and then ended up also doing a conference paper on the topic and doing a publication in Forum. But I continued to hear very distinct things about the Klan, people having strong opinions about the Klan that perhaps don't match reality. I think the most recent one I heard was Nick Cannon went on a podcast and said that the Democrats were the party of the Klan, something like that. And I continue to see these memes go up time and time again. So I thought it would be helpful for us to dive in and look at the Klan. And the reason why the Klan ended up crossing into the study of religion is because the Klan was a deeply Christian nationalist entity. And we're going to see this in two parts. We're going to start today by trying to understand the political identity of the Klan. And then in the second part of this video, we're going to look at the Klan and their belief system. So we're going to kind of dive in and look at what the Klan's platform was. And so to start this off, there's basically going to be two things we're going to look at today. First, we're going to try to understand what was the Klan's political leanings or affiliation. Were they Democrats? Were they Republicans? Were Democrats or Republicans conservative or liberal, conservative, etc.? We want to tackle this first because by and large, what I see today in these memes is that people say something like Democrats are the party of the Klan, and that the Democrats of the 19th century were liberals just like they are today, and that the Republicans of the 19th century were conservatives then just like they are now. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to address that topic by looking at the sources from the time period to see what they tell us. And then we're going to see the Klan and how the Klan tended to lean in their own policies. And as we get through this, part of it, and I'll emphasize this again at the end, it's important to understand that with any entity, whatever they are, or whatever political leanings, certainly not all of the people of the time period who shared those political ideals would have been Klan supporters. In fact, we most certainly know they were not. But it does help us to have a true and honest history in a time in which we have people who just want to say fake news for anything that they don't like to hear. We're going to look at the primary sources. And one of the best primary sources we have is that the United States government back in 1872, produced a report known as the Conditions of Affairs in the Late Insurrectionary States. This is commonly known as the Ku Klux Report. It's a massive report. It's, I think, 13 volumes of report, and it goes state by state. There's thousands upon thousands of pages. I've read way too much of this, and my brain has been sauced through the years from having read so much of it. But we want to start by understanding the question of, was the Klan a conservative or a liberal entity? Because as it's being consistently portrayed today, people are constantly saying things like the Klan is from the Democratic Party. And of course, the idea whenever someone says this is that it's a gotcha, right? You Democrats were the liberals who created the Klan. That's what the intent behind it is. So we're going to go through and we're going to start by just looking at, in the 19th century, were Democrats considered liberal or conservative? And by virtue of answering this question, we're going to understand whether Republicans were considered to be liberal or conservative. Were they left or right? So we're going to start by that. And I'm going to go through some of these quotes here. These all come from that insurrectionary Ku Klux report. And by and large, a lot of these questions and answers that you're going to see here, these are sworn in interviews that are being given by people at the time regarding their various interactions with groups like the Klan, but predominantly it's the Klan, and the affairs that were taking place in the South following the Civil War and the attempts at orchestrating Reconstruction. So we're going to go through this, and we're just going to start with the baseline of whether or not conservatives were Democrats or Republicans in the 19th century. In this first quote here, we see a question and answer going on, and the question is, to what party did those leading men, Coker and Barnes, belong? Answer, to what they called the Conservative Party at that time. They were opposed to the Republican Party? Oh, yes, sir, bitterly. They hated them. They got so there at one time that they would not give a Republican any work, and if they went to sell a Republican anything, they would charge him double price. They had a terrible time there at that time. So once again, what you see here when we're kicking things off is that the Conservative Party was opposed to the Republican Party. Now, the immediate question should be, if the Republicans of the 19th century were conservative, then why would the Conservative Party be opposed to the Republicans? And the answer is they wouldn't. But we're going to continue on through this, and we're going to see this trend sort of come into play. Our next one from the chairman is a question, have you been back there since that time? I have not been there since August 1870. I was in charge of that portion of the country there, of 6 of those counties, as an agent of the Freedmen's Bureau. It was a lawless country then. Murders were taking place constantly. While I have no data right at hand now, I remember a conversation I had in the spring of 1868 with the sheriff of Jackson County. He was a conservative or a Democratic sheriff. I remember well in our conversation, in talking about a murder that had taken place a few days before, he said that was the 60th murder that had taken place in that county since the surrender. So notice again here, what we see is that this sheriff was a conservative or a Democratic sheriff. In other words, as a Democrat, he was considered a conservative. Continuing on into another line of questions. Here we're going to see the chairman ask a whole series of questions about different people. And this one's very insightful because we're getting both Republicans and Democrats, and we're going to see the contrast. So question, what is A.B. Hagen? Answer, rather more conservative than anything else. What do you mean by conservative? I think he is more with Democrats than with Republicans. What is A. Peeler? I cannot tell you his politics. What is C.E.W. Collins? Conservative, Democrat. What is A. Grant? Republican. What is C.B. Simmons? A Republican. What is G. Bush? I think he is a Republican. I am not certain. What is Thomas Lancaster? I think he is a Republican. What is F. Franklin? I am rather inclined to think he is a Republican. What is Miles Price? He is a conservative. What do you mean by conservative? Answer, a Democrat. In other words, once again, we see the same pattern taking place. Democrat and conservative are being spoken of synonymously by all of these witnesses coming up in the 1870s. And we're going to continue to look at more and more of these examples because we want to understand that this is a trend. Although what's interesting is that there are times in which maybe people think of conservative as being something that's a little bit of a rebellion against Democratic. Continuing on. The report of the Senate committee in relation to election frauds in Pulaski County exhibits disclosures equally, if not more revolting than the frauds in Hot Springs, all of which were perpetrated by members of the Republican Party, and in which no Democrat or conservative had the slightest part of complicity. So, in this part of the report, interestingly, the speaker is claiming that the Republicans were responsible for great election frauds in Pulaski County. And as part of that, they're saying that no Democrat or conservative had the slightest part of complicity. So, notice once again, Republican is the opposite of conservative in this source. Continuing on, we see questioning by Mr. Poole. Question: he said that to Mr. Finch? Yes, sir. Is Mr. Finch a white man? Yes, sir. He is a white man and belongs to the Conservative Party, as he stated to me. The Democratic Party? Yes, sir. Some of them call it the Conservative Party, and some of them call it the Democratic Party. So here what we see is that for some people, they think of conservative and Democrat as being sort of alternate names, but the same basic thing plays out. Notice that again, conservative and Democrat go synonymously together in these witnesses. Continuing on, what were the politics of the bondsmen? Answer: they were always conservative. I never knew a Republican to sign one of these papers. So the obvious question would be, how could you never know a Republican to sign a paper if the bondsmen who were signing the papers were always conservative? Well, the answer is they couldn't, because once again, we're seeing the pattern take place here, which is that at the time, Republicans were not viewed in the 19th century as being conservative. They were viewed as being left-leaning. And in fact, that branch of the Republican Party that went hardcore into complete emancipation of slavery and emancipation of Black Americans, they were called radicals. So they were the ones who were viewed as radical because they were so far left, according to the right-wing Democrats of the period. Now, continuing on, just to make sure we have enough examples to show everybody that this pattern continues on. Question: and he brought it out at night? I look for it to pervade all the counties in the coming election for convention. I have no doubt that it will. I have no doubt that the organization will be started again and revived all over the state for that purpose. The only thing that may keep it a little down is that a great many conservatives or Democrats in that section of the country are against the convention on account of the homestead question and some others. So once again, we see that in correlation to the Ku Klux Party, in this case, we have conservatives / Democrats that may oppose this particular convention because they had concerns about the homestead question. And again, the context of all of these things can be found in the report, and I will put the titles in the description below so that you are free to dive in. And by the way, all of this is public record. You don't have to dive in and look for it in the dank corners of libraries. If you're under the age of 35 and you've never heard of a library, that's these places where you can go get books and stuff. You can get all of this stuff online. All of these are digitized and available for you to examine. Another line of questioning: what is the politics of buyers? Answer: conservative or Democratic. We understand it to be all the same down there. I believe they always write it Democratic, conservative. Once again, another example that in fact Democrats in the 19th century were conservatives. Another example. Question: do you mean the newspapers of one political party? Yes, sir. I mean the Democratic newspapers, or as they are sometimes called, conservative, which means exactly the same thing. Now, bear in mind, in going through all of this, what's important to understand, these are 19th century documents. These are not wacky, rewritten things. This isn't some bizarre attempt to rewrite history. This is just testimony from the 19th century. One of the reasons why it's so important to go through this information is because starting about, at least for me, about 10 years ago, I noticed a trend in which many people started to deny what we know as Southern strategy even existed. That was when the Republican Party turned its sights to the South and attempted to win over Southern states with a new platform. And that led to what we have seen as the large switch, whereas in the 19th century, you saw the southern states were consistently still conservative, but they were Democrat, and now those states are Republican. And the reason is because there was a switch. And whether or not somebody chooses to acknowledge the reality of Southern strategy. You can't change that. But what we can do is we can look at the sources from the 19th century. And when we can consistently see that Democrat and conservative were synonymous, and that today, Democrat is not synonymous with conservative, it's synonymous with liberal, that should tell us something, which is that party platforms have changed and those party identities have changed. The reason why we would deny this is rather bizarre. Of course, party platforms and party identities are going to change, but it seems to be a way for people to try to engage in sort of a gotcha approach rather than just looking at the honest history. By the way, not that in any sense of the form that somebody in the 19th century from either of these parties somehow speaks to what somebody in the 21st century in one of those parties would believe. That should make sense to us, but unfortunately, because of the time we live in, some people just can't really accept that. So now we're going to take a bit of a look into the views of the Klan themselves on political identity. And we want to understand whether or not the Klan was viewed as a conservative or a liberal entity in the 19th century and then even into the 20th century. So there's a couple of different ways we're going to approach this. Some is from the Ku Klux Report, and some will be from a historian like Walter Fleming, who wrote a history in 1905 about Reconstruction in Alabama. And so, for example, in this first quote, this is from Fleming, and Fleming writes, like Lincoln, however, Johnson so modified his plan that practically all the white people were to take part in the reestablishment of the government. The conservative theories contemplated restoration, not reconstruction. In other words, what Fleming is telling us in 1905 is that President Johnson did not aim to engage in Reconstruction. And Reconstruction as a historical effort in the United States failed horribly. There was no Reconstruction, which is the reason why we ended up with Jim Crow and segregation. What happened was those southern states did not want Reconstruction. They wanted restoration. They wanted the old ways back. They wanted to, if you will, conserve what had always been the status quo. And even though they could not legally own slaves anymore, the idea of creating a distinct and separate society was foremost to that. So what we see here in this quote is that President Johnson so modified the plan that he was aiming for what we would call restoration, not reconstruction. In other words, Johnson was not looking to create a reconstructed society which would involve integration. He was looking for a way of restoring the old customs of the South. Continuing back into the Ku Klux Report, we see in another series of questions, Mr. Stevenson is asking this, how do you mean that there has been a do in the papers? And the witness responds, as to the Enforcement Act, as it is called, there was never any remarks made upon it scarcely that was not called the Ku Klux Bill in the South, or anything of the kind. They did not seem to know what that was. Mr. Schellenberger's bill, when it came up, was a very stringent one and excited the feelings of the conservative classes of the community there very greatly. By conservative, you mean democratic. Yes, sir. They call it conservative there, where they do not want to be democratic. There are three different classes, and neither one of them wants to be any other. So they call themselves conservatives. When the Schellenberger bill, which would have been a very effective and stringent law if enacted, came up, they took exception to it and called it a little the loudest name of anything I ever heard in that section of the county. But when it was cut down to nothing and passed, they did not seem to know it. That is all there is about it. So in this case, a bill that was sometimes called, that upon it scarcely, it was not called the Ku Klux Bill. The attempts of passing a Ku Klux Bill greatly ignited conservative passion as being a bad thing. And so what we see here is that when the Ku Klux Klan was targeted in particular legislation, these conservatives in the area were not happy with it. Now, continuing on, tell me whether, in your opinion, The common denial by the conservative papers in the state and by all the Democratic candidates, Carson and others, has had a tendency to encourage the Ku Klux or otherwise. Answer: every conservative speaker, and I think every conservative paper except one or two, have gone on in such a way as to encourage them to keep them up. It is a matter of belief with me that 9/10 of the Democratic Party in North Carolina are either members of the order or have an idea of its workings and intentions and secretly and slyly encourage it. And some of them openly and boldly do so by their speeches and their writings, by apologizing for the outrages or denying them and also denouncing the subjects of the outrages as vile persons guilty of some crime. So here what you see very directly is that not only do we see Democrat and conservative as being synonymous again, but when it came to the Ku Klux Klan, every conservative speaker and virtually every conservative paper encouraged the Klan. And there's a reason for this. The Ku Klux Klan was a self-identified conservative entity. They were deeply rooted with conservative belief. Now, we're going to come back to that in a little bit to kind of hammer out the fact that that does not mean every conservative was a member of the Klan. It does not mean that every conservative then or now somehow therefore supports the Ku Klux Klan. That's the silliness of the time where we can't look at history and understand that things change. But we're going to continue on. James Skiles, in his testimony, was asked, how about those who do not belong to it? That's the Ku Klux Klan. Do any considerable portion give them countenance? Answer: most all of them speak in favor of them. I have found but very few men who spoke against them, very few indeed. How do you find that this organization is regarded in those communities? What do they seem to consider its purpose? So far as I am able to find out, the purpose is to control votes and to suppress any prosecution which may be brought against any of their party. Question: is it a political purpose? Answer: yes, sir. To which party do you think the organization belongs? Answer: so far as I have been able to find out, the Conservative Party has entire control of the organization. Which do you call the Conservative Party? Well, the Democratic Party. They call it here the Conservative Party, I believe. So here you have a witness from the 19th century telling us that the Ku Klux Klan is deeply embedded within the Conservative Party. And that Conservative Party is the Democratic Party. There's a pattern here, and I think it should be very clear by now. When people today deny that the Democrats of the 19th century were not conservatives, but were liberals just like they are today, that simply isn't accurate. And when it comes to the Klan was itself a self-identified conservative entity. In fact, what we're going to see in this next example is the way in which they directly called themselves that when engaging in nefarious activity. So Walter Fleming, in his book on Civil War and Reconstruction in Alabama, tells the story of C.C. Sheets. C.C. Sheets, a prominent scalawag, had been making speeches to the Negroes against the whites. The Klan visited him at his hotel at Florence, caught him as he was trying to escape over the roof, brought him back, and severely lectured him in regard to his conduct. They explained to him that the Klan was a conservative organization to hold society together. A promise was required of Sheets to be more guarded in his language for the future. He saw the light and became a changed man. So here what the Klan does is they bring someone in and they threaten him. They threaten someone who's attempting to empower Black Americans, and their identifying marker is that they're conservatives. So here you have the Klan itself telling people that they are conservatives. Continuing on, once again from Walter Fleming, it is probably true that few, if any, of the leading Democratic politicians were members of the Klan or of any similar organization. Under certain conditions, they might be driven by force of circumstances to join in local uprising against the rule of the radicals. But as a rule, they knew little of the secret orders. There were various reasons for this. The conservative leaders saw the danger in such an organization, though recognizing the value of its services, it was sure to degenerate. It might become too powerful. So what Fleming is telling us is that despite the fact that we do know that the Klan, once again, based on government investigation, the Klan had been, had tons of people, whether it was sheriffs, policemen, judges, local politicians. They had gobs and gobs and gobs of political figures that were members at some point. According to Fleming, he doesn't think that there were any real leading Democratic politicians who were members of the organization. But as he also noted, the conservative leaders did see the danger in the organization, but they also recognized that it had some value of its services. See, the problem is these conservatives were trying to balance the reality that the Klan could be a very dangerous, illegal, militant group, which it was for several years. But if the ends justify the means, which all too often they have in history, then what we're going to see is that, hey, maybe their work can be of value for us in maintaining that conservative ideology. Now we're going to skip ahead into the 1920s, and we'll cover this more in the next video, but the Klan resurged in the early 20th century. It kind of went fallow in the 19th century, but then it had a massive resurgence following 1915, and there's a specific reason for that. But this new Klan produced a lot of literature. And it also underwent some changes. So the question might be, did the Klan maintain that same sense of conservative identity when it re-rose in the 20th century? In looking at one of their pamphlets, Ideals of the Ku Klux Klan, there's no specific date on this, but the language itself looks very much like it came from the 1920s because it reads very much like most of the literature from the 1920s. And among the things that the Klan sort of perpetuates is their beliefs, and among them is the right use of the ballot. So a key point is, how should we vote? Probably a little bit fascinating. It says here, thank God the day of partisan politics is past. For those of us living in 2026, we have no idea what this person is talking about. But regardless, he continues, time was when parties stood for great principles, but today the difference between them is that of Tweedledum and Tweedledee. All right, so he doesn't seem to be too fond of either. However, he says, one of the parties must be induced to champion great fundamental American principles that will hasten the development of our country, or else a new party must come into being. As the matter now stands, we must cast our ballots for the right, as it is most nearly represented and championed by men regardless of party. So here the Klan is saying that even though we're not fond of either leftist or rightist, we're not fond of liberals or conservatives, we're going to cast our ballot for the right, and the right would be conservatism. Continuing on, in 1967, a new wave of investigations was done about the resurged Klan that came up because of the civil rights movement. And from that, the United States government was actually able to get a hold of some documentation of the Klan that was really not meant for public consumption. These were things that were a little bit more on the down low. And so this report from 1967 called The Present Day Klan actually tracked down a pretty interesting lecture where the Klan talks about some of the key components of their work. And among those components, or as it says here, they are socially, economically, physically. The weapon of propaganda can accomplish the first two in nearly all cases, and it should be practiced and follow up the action in the third case if practical. The will and capability of liberals, comsimps, traitors, atheists, and communists to resist and subvert Christian principles must be destroyed. So here you have the Klan openly saying that they need to destroy liberals, communist sympathizers, traitors, atheists, and communists. They have to be destroyed because these are the works of evil. In fact, it says this is our sacred task. And so they have a whole guidelines as to how to do this. And by the way, that last line, notice it says, this is plainly and simply self-defense. We have to destroy these entities. Now, the question, of course, we should be asking ourselves is, if the Klan was a liberal entity, as so many have tried to basically argue today, why would they be trying to destroy liberals? Well, they wouldn't, because the Klan was not a liberal entity. The Klan never was a liberal entity. The Klan was a conservative entity from its inception all the way through its various iterations. It always held to that sense of conservative ideology. And in fact, the Klan became so nervous in the 1960s about being tracked down for their various activities that they created basically a way of trying to camouflage themselves in public. So in this next bit, what you're going to see is that they had a recommendation to their members to try to basically take off any suspicion that they were part of the Klan. And it was this: if you are already known to be a member or an outspoken patriot, you should start right away to change your public image to that of a person who has become disillusioned with the right wing and the conservative movement in general. But you must be careful not to discourage anyone else while you are doing this. So, the Klan's work was to try to continue to be under the radar, right? Because they're a hidden organization. And in this case, what they're telling people is, because the heat is on us, uh, if you are right wing, if you are conservative, you need to start creating a sense to the public that you have become disillusioned with conservatism or right-wing ideology. However, notice that they also have a concern that if someone pretends too hard, they might cause another right-wing or conservative person to become disillusioned. Therefore, you have to make sure that you don't do it too much so that somebody else doesn't become disillusioned and therefore lose that sense of right-wing ideology. In other words, what all of these sources tell us very directly is that despite the efforts of people to say that the Democrats were the party of the Klan, the reality is the Klan was not a party platform for anybody. The Klan was initiated by Southerners, specifically people who had been a part of the Confederate Army, were the founders of it. And the purpose was to prevent Reconstruction. It was to try to save the South using a clandestine form of force, despite the fact that it was highly illegal. If you get enough people on board with it, or people who don't want to prosecute, then there are things you can get away with. But very specifically and repeatedly, what we see is that the Klan consistently identified as conservative. They did not always identify as Democrat. By and large, what we saw from the literature there is that they were known predominantly as conservative, and that their own literature referred to maintaining that sense of conservative loyalty. Now, what does this mean for today? Well, let's talk about what it doesn't mean. It certainly doesn't mean that every conservative today is therefore an ancestor of the Klan. That would just be ridiculous. The notion that because someone in the past from a party did something, that the future of that party does the same thing, this is the problem with our political discourse. It's gotten to a point where we can't have honest discussions. It's memes and it's gotcha stuff online. It doesn't address the reality. The reality is, yes, the Klan was a conservative group. Efforts to try to paint the Klan today as liberal Democrats are wrong. They are historically inaccurate. That's there in black and white for anyone to see. Southern strategy was a real thing. Democrats of the 19th century were not liberals, they were conservative. And the reason why Southern states who have maintained that sense of conservative identity are no longer Democrats, but they are predominantly Republican, is because party identities switch over the course of 150 years. That's reality. But regardless of whether or not the Klan was Republican or Democrat, why would that matter for today when it comes to today's politics? What is the great gotcha of acknowledging that in the 19th century, one particular party was the leading group for the Klan? That does not mean that, therefore, everybody today who is a part of that ideology is therefore a Klan supporter. The purpose of this video is to help us to understand the reality of the history. The history is the Klan was a conservative entity. They always have been a conservative entity. They always will be a conservative entity. That does not mean that every conservative is therefore a Klan member or a Klan supporter. Once again, we have to kind of bring it back to the reality of what the texts say. And just because the Klan was and is a conservative organization does not mean that that's part of every conservative. In the same way that if you're someone trying to say that the Democrats are the party of the Klan, which therefore some kind of an aha, we got you Democrats, well, that's absurd because somebody in the 19th century who was a Democrat Klan supporter, whether or not they were liberal or conservative, they were conservative, but whether or not they were either one would not have made a difference. The fact of the matter is that doesn't make a modern day Democrat, therefore a Klan supporter. The hope is that this video can answer some questions for those of you who are curious about it, to kind of chip away at a little bit of the ignorance, because many people have very strong opinions about something like the Klan, but have never read any actual sources from the Klan or the literature of the time. They just go with what's put out there. Hopefully this can help combat that a little bit, but overall, hopefully it can also bring some basic sense of discourse to say that, you know what, if you're a conservative out there watching this, and you thought for many years that the Klan was a liberal entity, and now you're realizing that they weren't because they weren't, well, that doesn't mean that you're a member of the Klan. That doesn't mean that you're a Klan sympathizer. It just means that you had an organization, a very evil and malevolent organization, that did in fact embrace conservative ideology. Every conservative of that time did not embrace Klan ideology any more than every conservative now would. Have a little bit of context, have a little bit of perspective. Hopefully this helps. Thank you so much for joining us. This has been an episode of Bible Search and Rescue. And until next time, go out and make the world a better place for somebody else. Take care, everybody.